It was just another quiet morning in the peaceful suburban neighborhood where Mary, an elderly woman, lived. The sun was barely rising, casting soft golden light on the streets. Mary, in her early 70s, had lived in this neighborhood for most of her life. She had always enjoyed the calm and comfort it offered. Today, like many mornings before, she was taking her dog, Max, for a walk around the block. Max was a large, strong dog with short, sleek fur and a proud, alert posture. Despite his calm demeanor around Mary, those who knew him well understood that Max was no ordinary dog. He had served in the U.S. Army, working as a highly trained military dog before retiring. His job had been to protect and assist soldiers in dangerous situations, and he had done it with unmatched loyalty and precision. However, now in his retirement, Max was content to live a peaceful life with Mary, his faithful companion. Mary had adopted Max after his service, knowing he needed a loving home after spending years on the battlefield. Over time, they had developed an inseparable bond. While he had been trained to handle tough situations, Max was always gentle and kind when it came to Mary. She knew his every move and could read his silent cues like no one else could. On this particular morning, Mary felt a sense of tranquility as she walked down the familiar path, Max by her side. The neighborhood was still quiet, the streets empty except for the chirping of birds and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. The crisp air made Mary feel awake and alive, even though she was getting older. Her slow but steady pace was matched by Max's relaxed walk beside her, his head turning now and then, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. But as they reached the corner of the street, something in the air seemed to shift. Mary noticed two figures standing on the sidewalk ahead, looking a bit out of place. They were young men, standing too close together, as though waiting for someone or something. Mary instinctively slowed her pace, feeling a slight unease, but she didn't think much of it. She trusted Max, and she knew he would keep her safe. The two men, unaware of the powerful dog walking at her side, began to approach her, their eyes locking onto her and Max. At first, their faces seemed friendly, but there was something in their posture that didn't feel right. One of them stepped forward with a smile, but Mary couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just out for a casual walk. Something about them made her uneasy. Max, sensing his owner's discomfort, stood still and alert, his head slightly tilted, his ears perked, and his body tense just enough for Mary to notice. It wasn't the first time Max had shown his protective instincts, but this time felt different. Mary had seen him in action before when he had defended her from a dog that had gotten too close in the park, but the situation now felt more serious. She could feel Max's unease, and she knew something was about to happen. The two men, still approaching, didn't seem to notice that their movements had caught Max's attention. They were focused on Mary, their eyes narrowed as if planning something she couldn't yet understand. Mary gripped Max's leash a little tighter, bracing herself for whatever would come next, knowing that Max was ready. As the two men approached, Mary felt her heart rate quicken. Something wasn't right about their presence, and Max's behavior confirmed her suspicions. The way they moved, too close to each other, and the way their eyes followed her every step. It wasn't a normal, friendly encounter. She had lived in this neighborhood for so long and was used to meeting people along the way. But these two had a different energy. One of the men, tall with unkempt hair and a casual yet aggressive stride, smiled in a way that felt more forced than genuine. "Hey there," he called out, his voice attempting to sound friendly but lacking warmth. The other man, shorter and more built, stood a little behind, watching Mary and Max carefully. He didn't speak, but there was something in his posture that made Mary uncomfortable, a sense of calculation, as though he was waiting for the right moment to act. Max's ears twitched, and his body tensed even more, now standing just slightly ahead of Mary, blocking her from the two men's path. He didn't growl, but the stillness in his stance was enough to signal that he was alert and ready for anything. Mary, though a little rattled, felt some comfort knowing that Max was by her side. She tried to steady her breath, attempting to keep her composure in front of the strangers. The taller man took another step forward, his eyes never leaving her, and Mary instinctively took a step back, clutching the leash tighter. Max shifted to stand directly in front of her now, positioning himself between the men and his owner. His muscles were tight, and his eyes were fixed on the strangers. He could sense their intentions even before Mary fully understood what was happening. "Just a little chat, ma'am. We're not here to cause any trouble," the taller man said with a hint of forced politeness. His voice sounded like he was trying to soften the situation, but there was an underlying tone that Mary didn't miss. She had lived long enough to recognize when people were trying to manipulate the situation, and these men weren't as harmless as they pretended. Mary stood her ground, though she felt her nerves rise. "I don't need anything from you," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. Her hand gripped Max's leash even tighter, as if by holding it, she could somehow hold the situation at bay. The shorter man stepped forward, his eyes scanning the surroundings, and then back to her. He was too close now. Max, sensing the increasing threat, gave a low growl, the sound deep in his chest, warning the men to stay back. His body was ready, every muscle taut, his focus solely on the two strangers in front of him. The men froze for a moment, startled by the growl, but the taller man quickly regained his composure. "Oh, come on, it's just a little chat. Don't make this more difficult than it has to be," he said, this time his voice edged with impatience. He took another step forward, closer to Max, clearly not taking the dog's warning seriously. Max, however, wasn't about to back down. He had been trained to protect, and that's exactly what he intended to do. His eyes locked onto the man's movements, every step he took bringing them closer to a showdown. Mary, still standing behind Max, knew that this wasn't just an ordinary confrontation. It was becoming something much more dangerous. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as the two men continued to approach, oblivious to the true power of the dog at their feet. The moment the taller man took another step forward, the air seemed to crackle with tension. Max's growl grew louder, more insistent, his body poised and ready for action. The men stopped in their tracks, eyes wide, as if they had suddenly realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary dog. Mary's heart raced as she watched Max, knowing that he was only trying to protect her. She had seen him react like this before, but this time, the stakes were much higher. Max's growl echoed in the quiet street, his eyes locked onto the taller man, unwavering. The man took another hesitant step, but the instant he did, Max's posture shifted. He stood even taller, his stance more aggressive. His tail was stiff, and his mouth was open, showing his teeth in a way that made even the bravest person pause. Mary could see the men's hesitation now, the uncertainty in their eyes as they realized that this wasn't just a dog. They were facing a retired military canine with years of training behind him. The shorter man, still watching closely, started to back away slightly, his eyes never leaving Max. He had seen the dog's reaction, and the message was clear. Any further movement would be met with a quick and decisive response. The taller man, however, seemed unwilling to back down. His hand moved toward his jacket, as if searching for something, and that small gesture set off something inside Max. The dog's posture grew even more intense, his eyes narrowing, and he let out another low growl, this one much more menacing. Mary could feel her pulse quicken as she watched the two men. She didn't know what they were planning, but she knew Max wasn't going to let them get any closer. She tightened her grip on the leash, silently thanking the dog for his loyalty and training. "Max, stay," she whispered softly, though she knew he didn't need the command. He was already fully aware of the danger they were facing. The taller man stopped his movement and took a few steps back, realizing he had pushed his luck too far. He wasn't scared, but there was now a visible wariness in his eyes as he assessed the situation. Max, sensing that the threat had momentarily paused, relaxed just a little, but his body was still tense, his eyes watching the men like a hawk. Mary, though shaken, stood tall behind him, her voice steady as she spoke. I said I don't need anything from you, Mary repeated, this time with more confidence. She wasn't sure if the men understood the gravity of the situation, but she knew that Max's presence was more than enough to deter them from doing anything foolish. The shorter man, who had been quiet up until now, spoke for the first time. Just calm down, okay? His voice lacked the confidence of his partner. He seemed more aware now of the power Max held, and that awareness made him second-guess their actions. The taller man, still trying to recover his composure, glanced over at his friend before looking back at Mary. Max's body remained unmoving, his eyes unwavering, and his growl softened, but only slightly. He wasn't going to let his guard down. The two men exchanged another glance, this time longer and more uncertain, as they realized that the situation wasn't one they could control. For the first time, they were the ones feeling threatened, not the other way around. Mary felt a sense of relief wash over her as the men took a few steps back, still hesitant. She knew that if Max hadn't been by her side, things could have turned out very differently. His training had kicked in automatically, and he had done exactly what he was meant to do: protect. Mary didn't know how long they would stand there, staring at each other, but she knew she had to stay strong. She wouldn't let these men intimidate her, not with Max standing guard. The standoff between Mary, Max, and the two men stretched on, the silence broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The taller man, still visibly shaken, took another step back, though his eyes remained fixed on Max. He seemed to realize that pushing any further might not end well for him or his companion. The shorter man, more cautious now, looked nervously at his friend, then at Max, before glancing quickly back at Mary. Mary, standing behind her dog, felt her heartbeat slowing, but she remained alert. She had never been in a situation quite like this before, but she knew that Max was more than capable of protecting her. His military training was second to none, and he had been taught to assess threats and act quickly. Even in retirement, the instincts that had made him an excellent working dog were still very much alive. Max's eyes never left the two men. His stance remained strong and unyielding, a silent warning that he was not about to let anyone get any closer to Mary. Mary could feel the dog's tension, but she also felt a sense of reassurance. Max was calm, but his calmness was that of a predator, fully aware of the situation and ready to spring into action if needed. She knew that if these men had any further ideas, they would quickly regret underestimating her dog. The taller man hesitated, his hand still hovering near his jacket, as if unsure of what to do next. His eyes darted between Max and Mary, a mix of frustration and uncertainty crossing his face. He had expected an easy target, someone vulnerable and alone, but he had found himself staring down an experienced and determined protector. "We don't want any trouble," the taller man finally muttered, his voice less confident than before. It was clear that Max's presence had changed the entire dynamic of the situation. He took another cautious step back, and this time, the shorter man followed suit. The tension in the air was thick, but for the first time, it seemed to be in their favor. Mary didn't let her guard down. She knew that while the men might be retreating for now, they hadn't left completely. They could be trying to think of another way to get to her, or perhaps they were simply regrouping. But with Max at her side, she felt a sense of strength she hadn't known before. The bond between them had always been strong, but in moments like this, it felt unbreakable. She took a step forward, her voice steady but firm. "I think it's time for you to leave," she said, her words clear and without hesitation. She wasn't about to let them think they could intimidate her any longer. Max gave another low growl, more of a confirmation than a warning now. The two men exchanged another quick glance, and this time, they didn't hesitate. Without a word, they turned and started to walk away, keeping their eyes on Max as they did. Mary watched them carefully, still unsure whether they were truly gone for good or just waiting for the right moment. But Max remained in position, his eyes locked on the retreating figures, not letting them out of his sight until they disappeared around the corner. As the men finally left, Mary let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her heart was still racing, but she felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Max. He had done his job without hesitation, his training kicking in exactly when it was needed most. He hadn't just protected her. He had saved her from what could have been a much worse situation. She reached down and gave Max a gentle pat on the head, her fingers brushing through his fur. "Good boy, Max," she whispered, feeling the weight of the moment. The bond between them had always been special, but in that moment, it felt like they were more than just owner and dog. They were partners, a team that had faced down danger together and come out victorious. Max looked up at her, his tail giving a small wag, as if to say he was ready for whatever came next. Mary smiled, a small but grateful smile. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for now, she knew that as long as she had Max by her side, she could face anything with confidence. As Mary stood there, watching the two men retreat into the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It had all happened so fast, and yet it felt like time had slowed down during the confrontation. She gently rubbed Max's neck, feeling the muscles that had been so tense just moments ago now starting to relax. But even as the immediate danger passed, Mary couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. She had lived in this neighborhood for years, and she had never experienced anything like this before. Max, though calm now, still had his eyes fixed on the spot where the men had disappeared. His military instincts were still sharp, and he wasn't going to let his guard down just yet. Mary could see the protective aura around him, like a silent promise that he wouldn't let anyone harm her. She had always known he was a special dog, but now she realized just how much he had been trained for situations like this. He wasn't just her companion. He was her protector, her partner in more ways than one. As the moments passed, Mary slowly began to relax, her mind returning to the reality of the situation. She was safe. Max had kept her safe. The men were gone, and there was no immediate threat. But the fear she felt during those tense moments didn't completely fade away. She had always been independent and strong, but today she had felt vulnerable. Vulnerable in a way she hadn't in a long time. She hadn't expected to be put in a position where she felt so helpless. Taking a deep breath, she decided to continue with her walk, but her pace was slower now, her eyes scanning the surroundings more carefully. She knew she had to be more cautious, more aware of her surroundings. Even though the two men had walked away, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that they might return. Max, sensing her thoughts, stayed close by her side, his ears alert, his eyes constantly moving, checking every corner, every shadow. He was more than just a dog. He was a living reminder of the loyalty and dedication of his past life in the army. Mary couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for him. She had always loved him, but today she realized just how much he meant to her, not just as a pet, but as a true hero. As they continued walking, the quiet of the neighborhood seemed to return, but it wasn't the same. Mary's senses were heightened now. She found herself listening more closely to the sounds of the street, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds. Every little noise seemed to carry more weight than before, as if her ears were straining to pick up any sign of danger. Max, however, remained steady, his calmness in contrast to her heightened awareness. He was the steady rock beside her, the reminder that no matter what happened, he would always be there to keep her safe. Mary paused for a moment, looking down at Max. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing he understood. There was no need for words. Max's loyalty had always been unwavering, and in this moment it was clearer than ever. He had saved her when she needed him most, without hesitation, without a second thought. It was in his nature to protect, to serve, and to keep her safe, no matter the danger. Her mind shifted to the two men, wondering what their true intentions had been. Had they been planning something more dangerous, or had they simply been looking for an easy target? Mary wasn't sure, but she knew she had to remain vigilant. In a world where things could change in an instant, she couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. As they made their way back home, the street felt quieter than usual. the calmness almost eerie. But with Max by her side, Mary felt stronger, more at ease. The day's events had shaken her, but she knew that with him around, she would always be able to face whatever came her way. Together, they were unstoppable. And that thought, in itself, was enough to ease her troubled mind as they walked home. As Mary and Max reached the familiar street leading back to her home, the sense of calm began to settle in. The world around them seemed to return to its usual rhythm, with the sounds of birds chirping and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. But beneath that calm, Mary couldn't shake the memory of what had just happened. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than usual, still on edge from the unsettling encounter with the two men. Max, ever the loyal protector, stayed close, his eyes scanning their surroundings, though his posture was more relaxed now. It had been an intense experience, one that had shaken Mary more than she cared to admit. She had always prided herself on being independent, self-sufficient, but the events of the morning had made her realize how much she depended on Max. The way he had instantly reacted, standing firm between her and the men, had given her a sense of security she never knew she needed. She couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for him. Max wasn't just a dog. He was her guardian, her silent hero. As they continued walking toward home, the memory of the men's retreat remained fresh in her mind. She replayed every moment over and over, trying to piece together what had gone wrong for the attackers. They had come with intentions of threatening her, perhaps with the hope of scaring her into compliance, but they hadn't counted on Max. She smiled to herself, knowing that they would never think of approaching an elderly woman in the same way again. Not when she had a dog like Max by her side. Turning onto her street, Mary felt a wave of relief wash over her. Her home, her safe space, was just ahead. She quickened her pace, eager to be inside, to feel the comfort of her familiar surroundings. But even as she approached her front door, a small part of her remained vigilant. She knew it wasn't over. The men had gone, but that didn't mean they were completely out of the picture. What if they decided to come back? What if they found a different way to approach her? These thoughts flickered through her mind, but she knew one thing for sure: Max would be there. As they stepped inside, Mary closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment. The quiet inside was a welcome contrast to the tension of the outside world. She felt herself relax, the familiar scent of her home, and the soft warmth of the space, giving her a sense of comfort. Max, however, remained alert, walking over to his bed in the corner of the room, but keeping one eye on the door, just in case. Mary walked over to the kitchen, her mind still racing. She needed to process everything that had happened, but part of her didn't want to dwell on it. She didn't want to live in fear, even if the situation had been unsettling. She had always believed that the world was mostly good, and she didn't want to let one bad experience change that belief. But at the same time, she knew she had to be more careful. The world was changing, and with it, she had to adapt. She couldn't take her safety for granted, not anymore. After a few moments of quiet reflection, Mary turned back to Max, who was now lying on his bed, his eyes half closed, but still alert. She walked over and knelt beside him, resting a hand on his head. "You did good today, Max," she whispered softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Max's tail gave a small wag in response, his way of acknowledging her words. Mary smiled, her heart swelling with affection for the dog who had been by her side through thick and thin. As the day continued to fade into evening, she felt a deep sense of peace. The men had tried to take control of the situation, but Max had turned the tables. She knew she was lucky to have such a loyal companion, and in that moment, she vowed to never take that loyalty for granted again. The world outside might still hold uncertainty, but as long as she had Max by her side, she knew she could face anything. Together, they were an unbreakable team. And that thought filled her with confidence as she settled in for the night, knowing that no matter what happened, she and Max would always have each other's backs. The days after the incident passed by quietly, but Mary couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. It wasn't just the knowledge that something dangerous had almost happened. It was the realization that her life had been intertwined with Max in ways she hadn't fully appreciated before. She had always thought of him as just a dog, albeit a special one with a remarkable past. But now, in the wake of their experience together, she saw him as more than that. He wasn't just her companion. He was her protector, her guardian in a world that sometimes felt unpredictable and overwhelming. Max, for his part, had returned to his usual routine. He slept soundly at night, always close by, as though he understood that his job wasn't just over because the immediate threat had passed. His days were filled with leisurely walks, his watchful eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, as if making sure nothing could harm his human. Mary had noticed that he had become even more protective, his posture more alert, and his eyes sharper than usual. It was as though his training had never left him. His instincts were still finely tuned, ready to spring into action if needed. Mary found herself watching Max more closely, admiring how he seemed to carry himself with quiet confidence. She had always loved him, of course, but now she felt a deeper sense of gratitude toward him. He had saved her in a way she couldn't have done for herself. Without him, who knew how the situation might have turned out? The thought alone made her heart swell with appreciation. One morning, a week after the confrontation, Mary decided to take Max to the park. She had been hesitant at first, not wanting to face the world outside after what had happened. But Max had given her a sense of safety she had never truly known before, and the park was one of their favorite places. She felt it was time to reclaim some of her normal life. After all, she wasn't going to let fear control her. The park was as peaceful as always, with children playing and people walking dogs of their own. Mary walked along the familiar path, Max by her side, his leash loose but ready. The world felt normal again, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax. She smiled as she watched Max interact with other dogs, his tail wagging gently as he sniffed around. He was back to his usual self, calm and composed. But as they neared the park's edge, a familiar unease crept back into her mind. She glanced around, half expecting to see the two men from before lurking in the distance, but there was no sign of them. The street was quiet, just like it had been when the incident occurred. Despite the calm, her instincts remained on edge. She couldn't completely shake the feeling of vulnerability, even though she knew Max would always be there to protect her. Max seemed to sense her change in mood. His ears perked up as he looked around, his body slightly tense. Mary stopped and looked down at him, sensing that something was different. The bond between them had deepened over the past week, and now it felt as though they shared a quiet understanding. She felt a strange comfort in knowing that Max would always be watching over her, no matter where they went. As they continued their walk through the park, Mary's thoughts drifted to the men who had tried to intimidate her. They had been foolish, thinking they could take advantage of an elderly woman without consequences. But the truth was, she wasn't just an elderly woman anymore. She was someone with a fierce protector by her side, someone who had experienced firsthand the loyalty and courage of a dog who had once served his country with honor. She felt a surge of pride. It wasn't just about surviving the incident. It was about the partnership she and Max had. They were a team, a bond that had been tested and proven in a way she never expected. And in that moment, as she watched Max lead the way down the path, she felt stronger than she ever had before. She realized that the world was unpredictable, yes, but it was also full of surprises. She had learned something about herself, about her ability to adapt, and about the quiet strength that Max brought into her life. The days of uncertainty had given way to a new sense of peace. With Max by her side, she felt ready to face whatever the future might hold. As they made their way home that afternoon, Mary looked down at Max with a soft smile. He wagged his tail in response, his eyes full of understanding, as if to say that together they could handle anything that came their way. Mary knew she had nothing to fear anymore, not as long as she had Max by her side. And that thought made all the difference. The days that followed seemed to carry a sense of peace, though it was a different kind of peace than Mary had known before. The events with the two men had changed something in her, something deep inside. She had always been independent and self-reliant, but now, with Max by her side, she felt a kind of security she had never experienced. It wasn't just about knowing that Max had protected her. It was the understanding that he was always there, a constant presence in her life, guarding her from any potential harm. He had become more than just a dog. He was her partner, her unwavering companion in a world that sometimes felt unpredictable. Mary found herself smiling more often these days, even on the quiet mornings when she and Max went for their walks. The bond between them had only grown stronger. She no longer just walked beside him. She walked with him. Max's movements were more confident now, his tail swaying gently as they strolled down the familiar path. He had always been a good companion, but now he was a hero in her eyes, not because of what he had done, but because of the silent promise he had made to always stand by her. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room together, Max curled up at her feet, Mary thought back to the day of the confrontation. It had been a simple walk in the park, something she had done countless times before. But that day had turned into something unexpected. She had faced danger, and in that moment of uncertainty, she had realized something about herself. She wasn't afraid of the world, not when she had Max by her side. It wasn't the dog's training that had impressed her most. It was his instinct, his deep-seated loyalty to her, that had made all the difference. As the weeks passed, life slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Mary found herself walking with Max every morning, taking the same route she always had. The neighborhood felt as safe as it ever had, but her perception had changed. She no longer took it for granted. She paid more attention to the world around her, listening for any signs of danger, yet always with the knowledge that Max would be there if anything ever happened. It was a quiet reassurance that comforted her every day. There were still moments when she found herself looking over her shoulder, a lingering caution in her step, but they were fleeting. She had learned to trust Max completely. The bond they shared was unspoken but deep. It wasn't just about protection. It was about the silent understanding that they were a team. He had shown her that sometimes the greatest strength doesn't come from the human side of the relationship, but from the unwavering loyalty of those who choose to stand beside you, no matter the odds. One evening, as Mary sat on the porch watching the sunset, Max by her side, she couldn't help but reflect on how much her life had changed. She had been forced to confront her own vulnerability, but in doing so, she had discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. She had learned that fear didn't define her, and that with Max by her side, she was stronger than she had ever realized. Looking at him, she whispered, "Thank you, Max. I'll never forget what you did for me." Max looked up at her, his eyes warm in understanding, and in that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, she wouldn't face it alone. With Max at her side, she was ready for anything. As the evening settled into night, Mary stood up and walked inside, Max following her quietly. They had faced something together, something that had tested them both. But now, there was only peace, a peace rooted in trust, loyalty, and love. And for the first time in a long while, Mary felt truly safe in her own home, knowing that no matter what, Max would always be there, ready to protect her and stand by her side, forever.